Was Jesus a socialist?
The AnarchoChristian Podcast, evaluating the relationship between the Christian and the state.
Give us a king to rule us when you're gone. His life's work had been to help the people understand it's not the role of a man to rule over other men.
Hi everybody, welcome back to the show. I am very excited to bring you a discussion I had with Lawrence Reed as we reviewed his new book, Was Jesus a Socialist? It seems like we only scratch the surface on everything he packs into this book, but we get into a ton of historical and biblical context to find an answer to the question, was Jesus a socialist? Lawrence Reed is currently the President Emeritus of the Foundation for Economic Education, also known as FEE. He has been a teacher, speaker, and author since the late 70s and served as president of FEE from 2008 to 2019. He holds a BA in economics, an MA in history, as well as 2 honorary doctorates. He has authored nearly 2,000 newspaper columns and articles for magazines and journals. He has authored or co-authored 8 books and is frequently interviewed on radio talk show and television programs. So without further delay, here is my discussion with Lawrence Reed. Mr. Reed, how are you doing today?
Hey, just great, Stephen. Thanks for having me, and I hope you're doing well, too.
I am, and I really appreciate you taking the time today to sit down and talk with us about your new book.
My pleasure.
And the book that we're going to discuss is Was Jesus a Socialist? And I just want to say on the onset that this is a great resource. It's new, so it's going to be a great resource for everyone listening who hasn't picked up a copy. And when they get this, I think that they're going to be very impressed with all of the biblical quotations, all of the quotations from theologians and economists, all dealing with this very popular question of, was Jesus a socialist, or is socialism, compatible with Christianity, and just all those sorts of questions?
Well, thank you, Stephen. I have to say that while I was writing it, I was hoping that it would be everything you just said it was. So I'm glad to hear that. It's written for a broad lay audience. It's not, exclusively for theologians. It's really for anybody. No one will have any difficulty understanding it. But you're right. I used extensive scriptural passages as well as supporting comments from prominent theologians, past and present.
And this is actually an expansion of an earlier essay that you wrote. And I went over that essay way back in episode 20 of the podcast. And this is quite the expansion. If I'm looking at it here, it has expanded from 11 pages to 131 pages, if I count this right. And,
yes.
So there's a lot of additional information.
Yes, and there's even more that I wished I'd put in. But, at some point you have to say, well, is this going to be a readable volume or a great big thick tome? So there's more that could be said, but I tried to cover the topic in a fairly comprehensive way so that anybody reading it would come away feeling well armed, that they know that Jesus was not a socialist and why.
Well, indeed, I think that they will. And as we just jump right into this, I think maybe the first place to start would be defining socialism, capitalism, and communism. And if you don't mind, there's a quote from the book where you say, it's socialism until it doesn't work. Then it was never socialism in the first place.
Yes.
And I really like that quote, and I think it's very true when we are discussing this. So, can we define socialism, capitalism, and communism here at the start?
Yeah, I'd be happy. And the reason that is not as easy as you might think is that socialists themselves don't completely agree with each other on what socialism is. And as I point out in the book, there was a time when it was widely perceived to be government ownership of the means of production. But when that was tried over and over again in so many places around the world and then proved to be a flop, then a lot of socialists said, well, that wasn't quite it. Maybe we'll figure it out and get it right the next time. It'll look a little differently. And so some socialists today say, well, it's really just a welfare state. And then there are others who say, well, it's central planning of the economy, too. It's really any of those or all of those. And certainly all of those various versions or forms reduce to one thing, and that is the use of force. I like to say that what distinguishes socialism from, say, capitalism is that it's not voluntary. If you listen to the promises of socialists, they don't have a laundry list of helpful tips for the suggestion box. They're proposing things that they aim to make compulsory. You will participate. You will pay for it, or else. This is one size fits all for everybody. That's what socialism is all about. If it was voluntary, it wouldn't be socialism, because you can do that under capitalism. In fact, some people say, well, socialism is owning things in common. And I always say, well, if that's what it is, what's holding you back? I mean, talk to your neighbors and get a group together and tell them, hey, let's all put our earnings in the common storehouse and we'll distribute them from there equally. You could do that now as long as it's consensual and voluntary. But of course, they don't do it. They don't even attempt to do it. The few times in history when it has been attempted, it just never fell apart in no time at all, including at Plymouth Colony in early Massachusetts. But the way to think of socialism is that it is the concentration of power for the purpose or purposes of central planning of the economy, the redistribution of wealth, or the promotion of government ownership of businesses or the means of production. It's one or all three of those objectives to one degree or another that socialists have in mind when they advocate their fantasy, and it's always backed up by force. Capitalism, I like to think of that as a much more natural, spontaneous arrangement. It isn't a human contrivance. It isn't some Rube Goldberg contraption that some academic has to dream up and plan out. It's sort of what happens when you leave people alone. When people are simply protected from the predations of others through force or violence or deception, and otherwise are left free to go about their lives, well, then what do? Without being told, they form enterprises, they invent things, they create businesses, they employ people, they produce wealth, they improve standards of living through voluntary, peaceful exchange. People say, well, that's capitalism. Yeah, it is, but it doesn't have to be, and in fact shouldn't be, planned by somebody from on high who thinks he knows what's good for everybody. It's characterized by such institutions as respect for private property, for voluntary, peaceful exchange. If you have a government, it should be confined to the protection of life and property, not running people's lives. And I think, too, one essential ingredient has to be personal character. In my book, I know this isn't frequently discussed, but I think we should discuss it more. I think a big difference between capitalism, freedom and free markets, in other words, on the one hand, and socialism on the other, is that the former requires that we live to high standards of character. There must be in society high standards of honesty and patience and courage and responsibility and intellectual humility and respect for the lives and property and contracts and associations of other people. If you've got strong character, whereby the great majority of people practice those virtues, then you can have freedom, free markets, or capitalism, same thing by another name. But under socialism, that doesn't require much character. In fact, if you don't have any, and lots of other people don't have character, socialism is what you're going to get sooner or later. Somebody's going to bring order out of the chaos, and you do what you choose not to do yourself. They're going to beat you into submission. So to prevent that, you got to have people of high character. And if they do, they have a chance then to be free to establish institutions like a free market in which they can flourish. And the other term you asked me to define is communism. There again, depends a lot on where you go for the source of this, but the originator of it was Karl Marx, of course, and communism to him was not the all-powerful state of, say, the old Soviet Union and its satellite countries. He would say, no, that was socialism. That was the dictatorship of the proletariat. And at some point, he prophesied that massive government edifice of control of people's economies would sort of wither away, to use his terms. And I can't help but smile when I say that, because how ludicrous is that? Marx never even ventured to guess how that might happen. Can you imagine a group of people who have somehow accumulated total power over everybody else, and they get to call the shots, and at some point they're going to say, well, we're done, we're out of here, see you later,
Right.
and give up all that power? I mean, it's one of the many ludicrous aspects of Karl Marx. So that's his view of communism. The actual outcome of the attempt to achieve it, really, is socialism, which is government control for all those various purposes that I mentioned.
I really appreciate that. That does, I think, clear up some of the misconceptions with those. But of course, those misconceptions exist, and they're always going to be part of the discussion. And I can't help but wonder, I guess, looking at the definition of those terms, why is it that socialism is so popular right now? I get maybe it's always been, but now we have new terms popping up like democratic socialism. We have current socialist governments that are existing and failing in front of us. I guess, could you just give us your opinion on why is it that socialism right now just seems to be so popular?
I think you have to give socialists credit for this. Most of them are pretty good marketers of a very bad idea. And so what they sell to people is, the hype, the rhetoric, the promises, the happy talk. It's the, we just mean to do well by people. We want to help them out. We're going to give them free things. We're going to provide them security. In other words, they tell you all about the velvet glove, but they never tell you about the iron fist beneath it. You find that out later if they actually achieve the power that they seek. And if you take young people, for instance, who seem to be, according to polls, as I point out in the book, increasingly drawn to socialism, they're young, they have a streak of rebellion in them, and they're also idealists. So when they have teachers, especially at college, where they get this overwhelmingly, who tell them, socialism, it's not all those things that the evil right wing tells you. It's just doing good things and helping people and sharing stuff with them. And well, then what young person who, without thinking more deeply, isn't going to say, wow, I'm for that. Why would I not want to be for that? That would make me an ogre of some kind. So the way it's sold, the velvet glove versus the iron fist, is responsible for bringing a lot of gullible people into it. But I'm very happy to say that when you look at the intellectual drift among people who really seriously think about these things, you'll find that there are a lot more former socialists than there are former believers in freedom and free markets. Mm-hmm. There are a lot more people who used to believe that the state was the answer, it was going to be the provider of all things, guarantee our security, give us free stuff, who, with a little time and experience, have come around to the view, that's kind of silly. Why would we trust our lives to politicians? They can't manage their own budget. They get everything wrong practically. They promise one thing and do another. They lie repeatedly. Why would anybody in their right mind want to turn their lives over to the state? But often that takes time for people to come to their senses and realize it. It's easy to be a socialist. All you have to do is want something that belongs to somebody else and have the desire to seize it by force. And bingo, that's all it takes. You're a socialist.
Well, and with these modern socialist movements, a lot of the, like I said, democratic socialism, but there's constantly a pointing back to a few European countries that are
Yeah.
that they say are socialist countries right now, and of course, it seems to be forgotten about Venezuela, which is
Yeah.
another current one that has failed. So, I guess could you explain a little bit of what's the difference between these socialist countries in Europe and Venezuela?
I'd be happy to. On Venezuela, by the way, there's another classic example of how, when Hugo Chavez came to power, the socialists around the world said, this is it. We're going to get it right this time. And as he expropriated and nationalized and raised taxes and went after enterprising people, socialized the economy, they were cheering. But now that the verdict is in on that, and it's an absolute humanitarian and economic disaster, they've kind of moved on. They don't say, maybe that was, maybe we didn't get it right there. They learn nothing from these experiments and move on to the next one, tyrannizing over whole populations in the process. I know that people like Bernie Sanders point to the Scandinavian countries in Europe as the kind of socialism that they want, but they're 30 or 40 years out of date. That just blows me away how these people can point to places like Denmark and Sweden and Norway, whose leaders are saying, "Don't call us socialists. We're not socialists." What Bernie Sanders and that crowd is referring to is that early in the last century, those countries had a strong period of free markets and capitalism. And then in the 40s and 50s, just like Great Britain did, they decided, hey, let's have a welfare state. We've become so rich we can afford it. So they traveled down that path. And what Bernie Sanders and the others don't realize is they've since abandoned that. If you look at the Index of Economic Freedom, produced by the Heritage Foundation, or in Vancouver, Canada, the Fraser Institute, and their Economic Freedom Index of the world, they show that those countries of Scandinavia are all among the top 30 freest in the world. The Prime Minister of Denmark recently pointedly said, I think I quoted him in the book, he said, "Quit calling Denmark socialist. We are a market economy. We don't nationalize things." Yeah, we have high taxes and we have a welfare state, but even that we've reduced because we found it to be disastrous. So these socialists really need to get their act together and read something that has been written at least within the last 40 years.
Wow, that really is incredible. That it seems to be just a term then that we can just grab onto, besides just the socialist term, but also the Scandinavian countries, that it's just something we can just grab onto and say, but we're not really taking the time to explain
Yeah,
that. So.
That's true. That's indicative of most socialist rhetoric. It rarely gets beyond bumper stickers. It's a struggle sometimes to get them to think a little more deeply and get acquainted with the fact that there is another side. So many of them think they know what the other side is, but you scratch that a little bit and you discover that they really don't, and they've never read anything from the other side.
Yeah, and so speaking of another bumper sticker sort of slogan would be Jesus is a socialist. So, So now we're getting into the Bible aspect of this. And I want to say that there's kind of two ways that we can touch on this, on the Bible aspect. Jesus being the main point here. That's usually where this conversation goes. But I think first, can we also talk about the Old Testament that you bring up?
Yes.
Specifically the Ten Commandments. In the book, you set apart two of them in this discussion, in this context, and that's coveting and stealing, which we find in the Ten Commandments. What is it that we're missing here when we're making this connection to the Bible and using it to defend socialism? What are we missing here with that?
Well, first of all, we should remember that with Jesus' coming, we have a new covenant. And a lot of the old prescriptions of the Old Testament no longer apply. But he very specifically said that he came to fulfill the law, not to. And by the law, he was referring, because this is the way people of the Jewish faith at that time saw it. The law meant the Mosaic law. And the cornerstone of that is the Ten Commandments. The eighth commandment says, thou shalt not steal. In my mind, that's pretty clear. It doesn't say thou shalt not steal unless the other guy has more than you do. Or thou shalt not steal unless you're just absolutely convinced you could spend it better than the guy who earned it. Or thou shalt not steal, but it's okay to hire a politician to do it on your behalf. Or if it's for a good cause. Right. It says thou shalt not steal, period, which is a pretty firm establishment of private property rights. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, I don't know what went on in the mind of God as he gave those instructions to Moses, but I'd like to think maybe when he got to number 10, he may have thought, these humans are going to be prone to steal, even though I told them in the eighth one not to do it. And so let me throw in number 10 because it's a motivation for a lot of theft, and that is coveting. So the 10th commandment says, thou shalt not covet. And so that's pretty important. One of the original 10 commandments says that you should not covet. Another word for that is envy. And throughout the Bible, Old and New Testaments, and from the mouth of Jesus himself, you have many criticisms of the notion of envy. It's the business of counting the other guy's blessings instead of your own. There's a passage in Proverbs, I think I quoted in the book, which says that envy rots the bones. It really leads to a lot of harmful pathologies, psychologies, and public policies. When you're driven by what the other guy has, instead of pulling yourself up and accomplishing something, you're going to be a prey, I think, to socialist doctrine, the core of which is envy of those who have more than you.
Yeah, I completely agree. It definitely is that starting point. And, Jesus says that, so much, it starts in the heart, Yeah. So now, I guess, getting it more into Jesus and where he stands on this issue, I really enjoyed the part in the book where you took 3 of the parables. So much of what we look to when we're trying to understand what Jesus said and understand the Gospels, we look to parables. Jesus told a lot of stories. I really like how you point out that there's theological interpretations of these parables. However, yes, it doesn't detract from some economic illustrations.
Yes.
And you say, and you make a claim. You say, but if you're looking in the parables of Jesus for evidence that he was a socialist, you're not going to find it.
That's right. There are almost 40, I think 37 or something approaching 40 parables that he tells in the New Testament. Most of them are pretty definitively focused on personal character, salvation, eschatology, and that kind of thing. But there are 3 that have a pretty strong economic content. Mm-hmm. And as I mentioned in the book, if Jesus really wanted to send an ambivalent message about the proper role of government in society or what kind of an economic system he might support, he would have chosen maybe 1 or 2 of those that might have had socialistic leanings, but none of them do. One of them, of course, is the parable of the Good Samaritan. And everybody knows that story. It's about a man who comes upon another who is injured and perhaps beaten to within an inch of his life. He's in great need. What does the Samaritan do when he finds him? He doesn't say to the man, well, you should contact your social worker, or maybe the emperor has a program for you, or wait a minute, I'll be back if I can get some politicians to pitch in and do something with other people's money. No, what he does is he immediately, as Jesus himself tells the parable, he immediately, of his own free choice, decides to help the man with his own resources. If that Samaritan had made any of those other conclusions, if he had just said, call your social worker or anything like that, let the state take care of it, we would not know him today as the Good Samaritan. We would probably think of him as the good-for-nothing Samaritan. So when Jesus told that parable, I think he was trying to say, it's got to come from the heart. It should be by free choice. Help those around you who are in need. don't think you've accomplished that objective by simply calling the cops or the police or the politicians and have them do it. Another parable is of the talents, the parable of the talents. At that time, a talent was a weight of precious metal, a coin. And as Jesus tells the parable, there's a wealthy man who is leaving his estate for a time, and he trusts three men with various divisions of his wealth, or a good portion of it. And he says to them, when I get back, I'll see what you've each done with it while I'm gone. Then he comes back and he says to the first man, what did you do with what I gave you? And that man, I'm paraphrasing, basically says, well, I buried it in the backyard. Now, I've got just exactly what you trusted me with. Isn't that great? And he's rebuked. You're like, what? You didn't do anything with it? You just let it sit there? You didn't magnify it in any way? That's terrible. And then Jesus says, well, the second guy, he actually doubled it or tripled it, multiplied it in some way, invested it. And in the parable, Jesus praises that second man. And the third guy basically says, those guys are pikers compared to me. I had even more success. I turned it into many times what you trusted me with. Now, if Jesus were a socialist, at that point, you know what he would say. He would say, oh, you third guy, you're full of greed. And who'd you victimize? Who'd you rip off to get more income like that? But no, Jesus praises him for creating new wealth. And he also says, I'm going to take the money from the first guy and give it to the third guy because he knows how to magnify the wealth that makes people, feeds and clothes and houses people. No socialist could tell that story. And then the third parable is of the workers in the vineyard. And a vineyard owner is eager to get the harvest in. And he hires some workers early in the day, agrees to pay them a denarius. And then later, as the day goes on, apparently he realizes he doesn't have enough. He's got to find more workers. So he hires another group around noontime and says, look, if you work the rest of the day for me, I'll give you a denarius. And they say, okay, for the same rate that these other guys are started early in the morning for, and we'll work this all day and into the evening. And then with maybe an hour to go before dusk, with the harvest needing to come in and more workers required, the vineyard owner hires some more people and says, if you'll work this last hour for me, I'll give you a denarius. Okay. Then later they all gather, and of course the first group is complaining. How come we worked all day and we get just as much as that last group that came on just for the last hour? This is unfair. And Jesus in the parable has the owner saying to them, what are you talking about? It's my money. Didn't you agree with me to work for the denarius? Didn't I give you what I promised? Didn't I fulfill my end of the bargain? Of course I did. Get out of here. And that is a magnificent endorsement of things like private property, voluntary contract, and I think even supply and demand, because it's not too hard to think that maybe the guy realized, I got to pay a premium. How am I going to get these guys at the end of the day, maybe pull them away from their supper and work for an hour into the evening? I better pay them accordingly. So again, no socialist could tell those parables the way Jesus did, because there's nothing in them that support the ethics or the economics of the socialist idea.
Yeah, and that is really incredible that these truths that Jesus is giving out that also have vast theological implications also utilize these economic illustrations, and they just back up these ideals that we have outside of socialism, where socialism seems to have the corner on the caring for someone, market, but it's the way that it plays out, right? And the way that we go about doing that.
Hey, could I take a second and give you one that's not in the book?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. It's not a parable. It's a story in the Bible, I think recounted in both Matthew and Luke. Everybody knows it as the story of the loaves and the fishes, where a multitude of about 5,000 people gather to hear Jesus. And the disciples come to him and say, "Oh my gosh, all these people are hungry. They're going to be expected to be fed. We don't have any food." Well, there's a little boy nearby who apparently has 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes. And the disciples say, "Well, maybe we can make a deal with him, but that's all we got. And then there's 5,000 people. What do we do?" Well, Jesus could have said to the disciples, "Well, I think there are probably some rich people not too far away in some neighborhood somewhere, or maybe a grocery store. Why don't you go raid those places and bring the loot here, and we'll distribute it? Or go take it from somebody who's got more, so we can give to those who have less." But he didn't. In fact, the first thing he did was he turned to Philip, one of his disciples, and asked a very capitalist question. He said, "Philip, where are we going to buy the food we need to feed these people?" Mm-hmm. And the Bible itself goes on in the very next sentence to say he knew what the answer was. He was just doing this as a test to Philip, a test of his faith, but he already had determined what he would do. And then he did it. Mm-hmm. And what he did, of course, was he used his own unique power to magnify that little batch of 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes into enough food for the 5,000. He didn't take a crumb from anybody else. He created wealth. That is a very capitalist thing to do.
That is a very good point. I hope that that's going to be in part 2. So.
Okay. Yeah, I had to leave something for a sequel.
Yeah. And you do touch on several things that are in the Bible with, not just the parables, but the things, some other things that Jesus says and does. And, I want to leave that for the book. I want everyone listening to go out and get the book and to check on some of those other things that you touch on with the apostles. But I do want to say that I really did enjoy the references that you have to other theologians, and we're talking Augustine and Lewis and J. Gresham Machen, just some wonderful names, guys that I love to read, and it was really good to see quotations from them dealing with socialism and just that context of socialism.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, those are 3 great ones that I love reading myself.
And another one was Chesterton. That really stood out to me. I love Chesterton. I think that whenever I'm reading Chesterton, I just have a smile on my face the whole time. And I think that he must have had that same kind of grin while he was writing the whole time. But one quote that you have from Chesterton is, "I would maintain that thanks are the highest form of thought, and that gratitude is happiness doubled by wonder." Yes. And you spend a little time on that quote, and that was my first time to read that quote. And so I was wondering if you wouldn't mind just taking a minute and kind of going over that and how that applies to this topic.
Okay. You'll rarely hear a socialist, and then I'll get back to Chesterton, but on this very point, you'll rarely hear a socialist say, "Wow, look at all the wonderful things around us. Look at all the things that came from next to nothing that some people put together, took a risk on, and created for me, and I can get it now at a song, a fraction of what it went for when it first appeared on the market. What a marvelous world in which we live." You don't hear socialists saying that. They tend to be angry people, not grateful people or happy people. They're always looking for victims. Everybody's a victim. And they don't take time out, as Chesterton implored us to do, to recognize what an awesome world we live in and the wonderful, incredible things that human beings are capable of when you leave them alone. So Chesterton was talking about we live in a world of wonders, and yet most people go through it without a moment of awe. They take everything for granted. They think fruit is just always there, for the picking. And just as socialists think that wealth just magically appears, waiting for them to take it and redistribute it. They have no theory of wealth creation. So I'm going a little bit off from Chesterton to socialism again. But, when those of us of a free market persuasion talk about wealth creation, we use such terms as investment and savings and risk-taking and entrepreneurship. And, we have all kinds of explanations and terminology for the process of creating wealth. Adam Smith wrote an entire massive volume on the wealth of nations and how it comes about and how awesome it is. But you ask a socialist, where does wealth come from? What is your theory of wealth creation? I've yet to run into one who will tell you much. It's just sort of there. We don't know. We just have theories about what to do with it once somebody else has taken the risk to create it. Well, how silly is that? I mean, that's as deep as they get. They have all kinds of schemes for redistributing wealth, which they're not in awe of in the first place, as Chesterton wanted us to be. They just take it for granted, and it's just there for them to take, and they figure it'll just keep producing itself, no matter what they do with it. It's frustrating for those of us who insist on things like reason and logic and observation and history and evidence and so forth, to run into these socialist schemes that are founded in ephemeral nothing.
Yeah, and I found myself reading that quote and reading your explanation of it, and just thinking about that wonder, having that wonder, and like you said, just kind of taking it back to that point, wondering where it came from, or being amazed by it even being there. And there's some things where I find myself wondering at that. I sit back and I look at the way that things have grown just in the past couple of decades, and not just the innovation from just technology growth per se, but the things that are kind of around that technology growth, things like ordering things online with your smartphone, and it's there in within a day or hours or minutes. That sort of thing is just I sit back and wonder about that. I remember cutting out advertisements and checking off boxes to order something through the mail, and you might get it 2 months later.
Yeah. Oh, I remember along those lines in 1987 when we opened our office at a think tank in Michigan called the Mackinac Center. Somebody who stopped in to talk about what we were planning to do, he said, "Oh, you need to get a fax machine." I said, "Fax machine? What's that?" They were still relatively new. And he explained it to me. And I said, "You mean I can put a piece of paper in my phone somehow, and it's going to come out seconds later from somebody else's phone, halfway around the world maybe, and it's going to look just like it was when I stuck it in?" And he said, "Yeah, that's what it does." And I said, "Oh my gosh, I'd love to have one of those, but I don't know anybody who's got one, so I'll just wait to see if it catches on." Well, look what's happened since. It caught on and then disappeared. And now we have iPhones and devices that do amazing things that nobody could have predicted several decades ago.
Yeah, and it really does help, I think, just to sit back and think about that stuff. Think about where this was created and have that sense of wonder. And so I really appreciate you putting that in the book. I think that is something that is, everything is about measuring. And that one's hard to measure. Just to sit back and think and have that sense of wonder.
Yeah, if you have that sense of wonder or can develop it, and just the sense of awe really is just slightly stronger maybe. But then I think it leads to you being a more grateful person, because all of a sudden you realize, wow, there are things that are very good in this world happening to me or available to me that are not of my doing. And so I'm grateful for that. Thank you, whoever did that.
Yeah.
That's why I wish socialists could have a little gratitude. But instead, you hear them saying things like this to wealth-creating, risk-taking entrepreneurs, as President Obama did. "You didn't build that." Mm-hmm. In other words, nothing special. Besides, you had a lot of help. The government made it possible for you, even if the guy was a victim of his local rotten government schools or all kinds of stupid government regulations. It's still, he didn't build that. The government helped him do it. That's the socialist attempt again and again to denigrate the awesome things that people do all around us every day.
So what can we do, I guess, moving forward? Someone has read your book and they're being convinced out of these wrong definitions that we've had about socialism and capitalism and free markets, but what can we do, especially for the Christian socialist? Yeah. What can we do to convince socialists out of that mindset?
Maybe several things. First of all, I think we have to be good examples ourselves. We have to walk the talk. We cannot be preaching one thing and behaving in a different way. And so people tend to learn by example as much or as powerfully as they learn any other way. And so if you want to be a person of some influence, if you want to be able to maybe convince that even Christian socialist that he is in error, try to be the most appealing persona that you can be. Be calm, be patient, be reasoned, ask questions. Don't just lecture at the other person. Don't be condescending. How you behave, as Jesus taught, toward others is a big part of the formula for winning them over. So that's important. But so be the best example you can be. And that starts with the people you are around the most. Your family, your neighbors, fellow Christians in church, the local folks that you have an opportunity to interact with. Be the best example you can be in front of them, so that someday they will say, wow, there was a man or a woman of character, and you knew where he stood, and he didn't prevaricate, and she told you what she told the last audience, not something different just to appeal to you. That was a person of character. That's vitally important. And then you have to commit yourself to education. This is a battle for the hearts and the souls and the minds of our fellow human beings. It isn't a battle you can win by force or anything that intimidates or that confiscates or beats people up or tries to beat them into submission. This is a battle of ideas. So be the best, most eloquent example you can be for these ideas, and you'll be amazed at the doors that will open and the numbers of others who come and say, tell me more. There's something about you that I find appealing. Give me your ideas a little more fully.
I completely agree. I think that politics and these sorts of discussions can get heated so quickly, and so much can be lost or gained just on the simple way that we interact with each other. Yeah.
That's, by the way, when people ask me what should I read in economics or current events, those kinds of things, they often think I'm going to recommend nothing but a list of economics books. There are some that I would love for people to read, like Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. Mm-hmm. But I also tell them, read some very good books about personal character formation. One of the classics is Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. But still, all these decades later, the tips it gives you about making yourself someone that others will want to learn from and respect are still every bit as valid. More recently, a book by Olivia Cabani, Cabane, called The Charisma Myth. I think it's fantastic. I came away with 2 or 3 gems of advice on every page, and I recommend that very highly.
Okay, well, and I will have links to those books as well in the show notes, so anybody listening can find that easily. So I guess one more question while I have you today. How can Christians help without a state? One of the big charges with socialism is that we have to take care of other people. And so it seems to be the default that we would form a state and we would need to form these giant regulatory centralized bodies to do this. How can Christians, not participating in socialism, how can we help?
I think we have to start with a serious understanding of an eternal principle, and that is that government has nothing to give anybody except what it first takes from somebody. It's not a fountain of free goodies. If it's given it out, it's because it took it from somebody in the first place, probably you included. And then it keeps its own hefty bureaucratic brokerage fee to handle the transfer. And then on top of it, it usually dispenses the end result to the needy or whoever in a very ineffective fashion that often compounds the problem that led to the need in the first place. We know from our experience with government welfare programs that they've destroyed families. You pay families more if the father leaves home. But private charity doesn't behave that way because, after all, private charity would dry up. People would stop giving if they had the same kind of track record of success as government welfare does. So we need to stop thinking that the state is an efficient way to get the job done. It's an inefficient way to screw the job up. That's the way to think of it. And so then we have to realize, too, that if you really want to help people, well, get down and dirty and do it. Be a volunteer. Give locally. Give to charitable groups that you can stop in and visit from time to time and see how they're doing. Nobody does that with the welfare department. So is it any wonder that it's such a expensive disaster? Christians should realize that most of what government does in the name of helping the needy just preempts what private charity would be happy to do. But once we say, oh, it's a government responsibility, we kind of all instinctively pull back. So it's not really adding much to the pot when government gets involved. It's just redistributing it, minus that bureaucratic brokerage fee, and with all the inefficiencies and poor pathologies in the process. I think even socialists understand this instinctively. They don't say that, but instinctively. And why do I say that? Well, just look what they give. I mean, you could look at the federal budget and look at the line that says donations. It's peanuts. Almost nobody gives to the government a nickel more than what they're required to at gunpoint. Mm-hmm. Not even socialists do that. If they really thought that the welfare department was the best way to solve problems of poverty, they'd be writing checks to the welfare department. But to the extent they give at all, and they do give a lot less than those with a different persuasion. To the extent they give to help poor at all of their own free will, they too give to things like their church or the Red Cross or the Salvation Army. Nobody writes a check to the welfare department as a donation. And the fact that they don't do that is revealing of another important observation. What is it that motivates a lot of socialists? Is it really the desire to help people, or is it the desire to punish some people? I think when you look very deeply, you discover that socialists would be in favor of things like confiscatory taxation, even if the government took the money and dumped it into the Pacific, because to them it's more important that we count the other guy's blessings and punish them for them. And so take it, and we'll figure out later whether it makes any sense to give it to this group or that group. But they're more interested in punishing people than in helping people most of the time.
Yeah, it's very telling. They like to say that the free market system is the desire is greed, whereas we could say that no, it's a desire to help your neighbor in this way, and then that desire to just, as you mentioned, to punish someone who has been successful. They must have done it out of greed.
And if you don't know how to magnify wealth yourself, you might well think that the only way it can be done is through theft or deception or fraud or cheating somebody. But the world of entrepreneurship, as I know it, is a very different world. Most of the people I know in business aren't in it because they want to accumulate gold coins and sit in their corner and play with them, but rather they do those things. They invest and create and form businesses because of the satisfaction that they get for creating something and sometimes solving other people's problems and gaining the voluntary approbation of their fellow man. Those are far more common motivations for the entrepreneur under capitalism than simply some sinister greed and desire to play with coins.
Well, Mr. Reed, I really appreciate your time today. And I, again, really appreciate you writing this book and expanding your essay. That I already very much enjoyed the essay. And so this book is one that's going to go onto my list of regular recommendations to people.
Thank you, Stephen. When you have this program posted somewhere, I will promote it on my Facebook page. I invite people to like my Facebook page, as you have, because I post a lot of related things there every day.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And I am a huge fan of everything that Fee puts out. It's just such good quality content from your organization.
Thank you. Appreciate it. We work hard at that.
So thank you again. I hope that you have a lot of success with this book release.
Thank you, Stephen. God bless you. And again, I really appreciate your having me.
So what did you think? Did Mr. Reed answer any questions you might have already had? Were you already familiar with the original essay? Be sure to check out the show notes or the website for links to read the essay online or to order it in print from Fee or Amazon. You can also listen to it from episode 20. And there will be links to the new book, Was Jesus a Socialist? And I highly recommend you get a copy today. While you're picking up the new book or checking out fee.org, don't forget to subscribe to the Anarcho-Christian Podcast on whatever podcatcher you're using. If you're not sure where to find us, visit anarchochristian.com/subscribe. There you'll find links to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Android, Google Play, and YouTube. If you're enjoying the podcast, please consider letting us know by leaving a 5-star rating and review on iTunes or wherever you catch the episodes. Also, like and share the episodes on Facebook or the other social media sites. You can support the show with a monthly donation through Patreon. Visit the support tab on AnarchoChristian.com. That will take you to our Patreon page, where you'll find a few ways you can support us. So I think that's it for today. Grace and peace. No king but Christ.
He cried out to God, won't you help them to believe? This power is illusion, the need to rule is greed. Your love and your light is really all they need. It's really all we need.
Thank you for listening to the Anarcho-Christian Podcast. Subscribe to our email notifications at AnarchoChristian.com, like us on Facebook.com/AnarchoChristian, and follow us on Twitter at AnarchoXP. Subscribe to our podcast and YouTube to join us next time as we continue to evaluate the relationship between the Christian and the state. No king but Christ.
This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.